Naomi Frey had $8 to her name, and she slid every last one of it under an old widow's door so the heat would not shut off before the cold came. The man watching her do it from the bottom of the stairwell had come to that building to take it from her, and what he saw in that thin yellow gap of lamplight stopped him on the second step and held him there for a long time. His name was Garrett Voss, and Garrett had not eaten a real supper in front of another human being in 3 years. He wore a good gray coat and good gray shoes, and he carried a leather folder under his arm with a list of names inside it, and one of those names was hers. He had come to deliver papers. He stood in the dark of the Ardsley stairwell on Pickett Street and watched a woman in a thrift store cardigan kneel on a cold floor and feed 4 torn dollar bills, taped at their seams, one at a time, under the door of apartment 2. He did not know yet whose name was on the eviction notice in his folder. When he found out, it would unmake everything he thought he had come to do. To understand what Garrett saw on those stairs, you have to go back into a life he knew nothing about, into a small dying town in the low country of South Carolina, into the world of a woman the whole street had quietly decided was foolish. Naomi was 34 years old, and she looked a few years older. Worn early by a load she had been carrying since before she was grown, she lived in apartment 4 of the Ardsley, 2 doors down and 1 floor up from Miss Ruthann, and she worked 2 jobs that nobody in town would ever brag about. In the mornings she ran the wash and fold at the soapbox on Gaines Avenue, hauling other people's laundry in gray plastic bins until her shoulders ached. In the evenings she was a home aide, which meant she bathed and fed and sat up with people the world had set down and walked away from. She was good at both, and neither one paid enough. Her mother had taught her the work. Cordelia Fry had cleaned houses and washed sheets and sat up with the dying in this same town for 40 years, and she had died 18 months ago in a county bed with her daughter holding her hand. She had been a small woman with strong hands and a voice that never rose, and she had raised Naomi alone in 2 rooms on Pickett Street and never once let her daughter feel poor, though they were. She did it by making the giving feel like wealth. On the leanest weeks, when there was nothing extra at all, Cordy would still find something to put in someone else's hand, and she would tell her daughter, washing the supper dishes, that the surest way to never feel poor was to keep being able to give. Naomi had not understood it as a girl. She understood it now, kneeling on cold landings with the last of her money in her fist. Cordy Fry had left behind almost nothing a bank would count. A worn King James Bible with the spine taped twice, a tin of buttons saved off 40 years of other people's discarded coats, a photograph of a man none of them ever named, and a habit her daughter could not seem to put down, no matter how thin the month got. The habit was Miss Ruthann. Ruthann Boyd was 81 years old, and had outlived a husband, a son, and every friend who used to knock on her door. She lived alone in apartment 2, with a space heater that ran on quarters of electricity she did not have, and a memory that came and went like weather. Some days she knew exactly who Naomi was. Some days she called her by Cordelia's name, and Naomi let her, because correcting an old woman about who loved her never once made the world a kinder place. Every Friday for as long as Naomi could remember, her mother had slid money under that door. Never much. A folded 5, a torn 10 held with tape. Whatever Cordy could spare after the rent and the light bill, she gave to the widow in 2, and she never knocked, and she never let herself be thanked. When Naomi asked her why, all her mother ever said was, "Because somebody has to remember her." That was the whole of the explanation Naomi ever got. Not pity, not duty. Just remembering. As if the worst thing that could happen to a person was not hunger or cold, but being forgotten while they were still alive to feel it. There had been a winter, when Naomi was 12, that she never forgot. The light bill had come due the same week the rent did, and there had not been enough for both, and Cordy had paid the rent and let their own heat go cold for 4 days, rather than miss the Friday under Ruth Ann's door. Naomi had been furious about it, the clean, useless fury of a cold child, and her mother had pulled her in under the one good blanket and said, "We can get warm again on Monday. She can't get her Friday back." Naomi had not understood it then. She had spent the rest of her life understanding it. After Cordy died, the Fridays kept coming, and Naomi kept sliding what she had under the door, because stopping felt like burying her mother a second time. This particular Friday, what she had was $8. She had counted it 3 times at the kitchen table before she did it. Rent math, heat math, bread math. She had $4 in torn bills, and 4 in change she had rolled into the torn bills with tape. And after she fed it under Miss Ruth Ann's door, there would be nothing in the apartment but a half loaf and a jar of peanut butter, and the cold getting worse outside. She did it anyway. She knelt on the landing and slid the bills through, one at a time, and she heard the old woman inside say to no one, "Cordy, is that you?" And Naomi pressed her hand flat to the cold door and did not answer, and went back up the stairs to her own dark kitchen. She never saw the man standing below her in the stairwell, but he saw her. It would help to know what $8 actually was in a life like Naomi's. It was a tank of gas that would not quite reach a tank of gas. It was the difference between the bread and the milk, never both. She kept a running ledger in a spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, the columns penciled in her own small hand, and the bottom line of that notebook had not shown a surplus in 3 years. She paid the rent first because losing the roof lost you everything else. She paid the light second because the cold in that town could kill an old person, and had. Everything after that was a negotiation with herself, conducted standing up at the counter at 11 at night, with her feet aching from the floors. People thought a woman that broke had no business giving anything away. They said it where she could hear them say it. The cashier at the corner store had watched her count out her groceries in coins more than once, and had said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that charity began at home. The man at the laundromat who dropped off his shirts told her she was a fool to spend a dime on a senile old woman who would not remember it by morning. Naomi heard all of it and folded it into the wash and said nothing. She had decided a long time ago that she would rather be a fool who gave than a wise woman who did not, and that decision was the one inheritance her mother had left her that no bank could touch and no eviction could take. Garrett Voss worked for a company called Meridian Holdings, and his job, stripped of the soft words they put on his business card, was to empty buildings. Meridian bought old apartment blocks in dying southern towns for almost nothing, pushed the longtime tenants out, painted the hallways gray, and rented the same rooms back to younger people at 3 times the price. Garrett was the man they sent to do the pushing. He was 44 years old. He drove a clean black SUV and stayed in chain hotels off the interstate, and had a daughter in another state who did not return his calls, and he was very good at his work precisely because he had taught himself not to look at the faces of the people in the doorways. The Ardsley was Meridian's newest purchase. 12 units, half of them empty, the other half full of people too old or too poor to fight. Garrett's instructions were simple. Get them out by the end of the month. There were 2 tenants behind on rent enough to evict outright, and the eviction would scare the rest into leaving on their own. He had the 2 notices in his folder. He had served the first that afternoon to a man in apartment 7 who had cursed him and slammed the door. The second notice was for apartment 4. He had climbed the stairs to deliver it, and he had stopped halfway because a woman was kneeling on the landing above him, feeding her last dollars under a stranger's door in the dark. He waited until she had gone back into her own apartment. Then, he stood there in the cold stairwell longer than he meant to, and for the first time in a long time, Garrett Voss did not want to do his job. He did it anyway. The next morning, he knocked on the door of apartment 4 and handed Naomi a folded white paper and said the words he always said. "You have until the end of the month." Naomi read it standing in her doorway in her work clothes, bins of other people's laundry waiting in her car. $4,000 in back rent and fees, the notice said, or be gone by the 31st. She had never in her life seen $4,000 in one place. She breathed once, slow, and she did not cry, and she did not curse him. She just looked at him with a tired steadiness that unsettled him more than screaming would have, and she said, "I've never once been late on what I could actually pay." "I know," Garrett said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. He walked back down the stairs slower than he had walked up them. If you have ever watched someone good get handed a paper that good people should never have to be handed, and quietly ached to see the world set it right before the end, then you already understand why this channel exists. And you belong here. Take 1 second to subscribe, because the people who do are exactly the kind of people these stories are for. And there is a new one waiting for you every week. Stay with me, because everything you think you know about the man on those stairs is about to turn over. Then, Garrett went down to apartment 2 to serve the third notice, because Miss Ruth Ann was behind on rent too, further behind than anyone, and Meridian wanted her gone most of all. She had the lowest rent and the biggest unit and the longest lease, and she was, in the cold language of the folder, an obstacle. He stood outside apartment 2 for a full minute before he raised his hand. He could hear the space heater ticking through the thin door, and under it, faintly, an old woman humming a tune he did not recognize. Low and tuneless and content. He thought about the woman upstairs sliding her last dollars through the gap so that this humming could keep happening. He thought about the regional manager's voice on the phone telling him the Boyd unit was the priority, the obstacle, the one they wanted gone most of all. He had served 1,000 notices in his life, and he had never once stood frozen outside a door. He raised his hand and knocked anyway, because the not knocking would cost him the only thing he had left, which was a paycheck and a reputation for getting it done. The old woman opened the door in a housecoat, blinking up at him with cloudy, gentle eyes, and before he could say a single word she smiled at him like he was someone she had been expecting and said, "Are you the boy who brings the money?" Garrett stood there with the notice in his hand and could not make himself hold it out. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm not." "That's all right," Ruth Ann said. "Cordy comes on Fridays. She slides it right under. $8 whole this week. Imagine that." And she laughed, soft and delighted, the laugh of a woman who had decided to be glad about a thing the size of $8, and she closed the door gently in his face before he could ruin it. Garrett went back to his SUV and sat there with the engine off and the notice on the passenger seat, and did not drive anywhere for a long time. What Garrett did not know, what nobody in that building knew, was that the Ardsley was not really owned by Meridian Holdings at all. Not the way it looked on paper. And the man who could prove it was 300 miles away in a glass office, signing the very deal that was about to put an 81-year-old widow out on the street. His name was Theodore Calloway. People called him Theo when they were brave enough to call him anything. He was 63 years old. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state, and Meridian Holdings was a small division of a company he owned a controlling share of, without ever having walked through a single one of its buildings. Theo Calloway had grown up poor in the low country and clawed his way into money, and somewhere along the way he had stopped looking at the small print of what his money did. The Ardsley was a line item, a dot on a spreadsheet of properties to clear. Except the Ardsley was not just any building, and Theo did not know it yet. Back on Pickett Street, the days got colder and the deadline got closer. Naomi worked doubles. She picked up extra shifts sitting with a dying man on Route 9, an old farmer with no family left. And she held his hand at 3 in the morning while he talked to people who were not in the room. And she did not let herself think about the fact that this was exactly how her own mother had died. Exactly the kind of bed, exactly the kind of silence. She scrubbed an extra round of floors at the soapbox after closing, on her knees with a brush because the mop missed the corners and she could not stand to leave a thing half done. She sold the one piece of jewelry she owned, a thin gold chain that had been her mother's, to a man behind glass at a pawn shop 2 towns over who looked at it under a loupe and offered her $40 and watched her face while he did it. She took the $40. She did the only kind of math she knew how to do, which was the kind where the numbers never reached far enough. $4,000. She could not make $4,000 by the 31st if she worked every hour God sent. She knew it, and she kept working anyway, because lying down was not a thing her mother had taught her how to do. And every Friday, she still slid what she could under Miss Ruth Ann's door. The neighbors noticed. They were poor like the whole street was poor, which is to say they had nothing and gave it anyway, and they had been watching Naomi do the same thing for a year and a half. Junie Pell, who lived across the hall and had buried 2 husbands and feared nothing, started leaving a covered plate outside Naomi's door on the nights she worked late, with a dish towel over it and a note that said only, "Eat." It was never much. Some nights it was a wedge of cornbread and a slick of butter. But it was on the floor every night Naomi came home past dark, and the towel was always warm, which meant Junie had carried it across the hall the minute she heard the car, in her own thin housecoat, on her own bad hip. Pastor Hollis from the little brick church on Gaines came by with $20 from the Deacons Fund and an apology that it was not more, and he sat at her table and prayed with her without once telling her that everything happened for a reason. Because he had been a pastor long enough to know that some things do not, and saying so out loud only adds a second wound to the first. An old mechanic named Walt Surrey, who fixed cars 2 doors down, filled Naomi's tank one morning without being asked, and waved off her thanks before she could finish it, muttering something about how the gauge had looked low, and he did not like to see a working woman stranded. None of it was enough to touch $4,000. All of it was enough to keep her standing. That was the strange arithmetic of a poor street. The numbers never reached, and the people always did. Garrett saw all of it. He had taken a room at the motel off the bypass to oversee the clearing of the Ardsley, and he found himself driving by Pickett Street in the evenings when he had no reason to, watching a poor street take care of one of its own. He had cleared 100 buildings and never once seen anything like it. In the towns he worked, people scattered when the notices came. They turned on each other. Here they were closing ranks around a laundress and a widow like a family that had simply decided no one was getting left behind. One evening he parked across the street and watched Naomi come out of the Ardsley and kneel, the way she did every Friday, and slide something under the bottom of Miss Ruth Ann's window where the casement had warped and left a gap. He got out of the SUV. He did not plan to. He crossed the street and he said, "Why do you keep doing that? You're being evicted. You don't have it to give." Naomi stood up and looked at the man who was putting her out of her home, and she did not flinch. "She doesn't know she's being put out," Naomi said. "Why would I take her last Good Friday away from her too?" Garrett did not have an answer. He stood on the cold sidewalk and felt something he had spent 20 years not feeling, and he heard himself ask a question he had no business asking. "Who's Cordy?" Something crossed Naomi's face. "My mother," she said. "She did this before me." 40 years. And she went back inside, and Garrett stood there in the dark with that word turning over in him. 40 years. And then, on the coldest night of that whole long month, the thing happened that none of them on Pickett Street could have seen coming. The thing that turned the entire account of Naomi Fry over from its first page to its last. That night, Garrett Voss did something he had never done in 20 years of emptying buildings. He opened the file, not the eviction folder, the deed, the actual chain of title on the Ardsley. The dusty bottom layer of paper that nobody at Meridian ever bothered to read because the lawyers had cleared it. He sat in his motel room with his laptop and pulled the county records, and he read the history of one small brick building on Pickett Street, going back 50 years. And somewhere around 2 a.m, he stopped breathing. The Ardsley had been built in 1961 by a man named Silas Calloway, Theo Calloway's father. And Silas Calloway, in a codicil filed with the county in 1979 and never since disturbed, had deeded a 1/3 interest in the Ardsley, in perpetuity, to the woman who had nursed him through his final illness and refused to leave his side when his own family did. He had written her name into the deed in his own failing hand. A cleaning woman, a nurse to the dying, a poor black woman from the low country who had sat up with a rich man in the dark and never once asked him for a thing. Her name was Cordelia Fry. Garrett read the name 3 times. Cordy, the mother, 40 years, the woman who had slid money under a widow's door every Friday until the day she died. He thought about the photograph the daughter would later show him, a man none of them ever named, and he understood without being told that some debts in this world are paid in silence by people who never send a bill. Silas Calloway had given her 1/3 of the building she would spend the rest of her life quietly serving, and she had never told a soul. Not a landlord, not a lawyer, not her own daughter. She had gone on cleaning houses and washing sheets and sitting up with the dying, a 1/3 owner who never once acted like she owned anything but the work in front of her, and the share had passed, on her death, to her only living heir, to Naomi. Naomi Fry owned 1/3 of the building she was being evicted from. The eviction notice in Garrett's folder bore the name of the very woman who was, in the eyes of the law, his client's partner in the property. Meridian could not put her out. Meridian could not put anyone out because a 1/3 owner had never signed off on a single thing they had done, and every notice they had served was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Garrett sat in the dark and understood, all at once, that he had spent 2 weeks trying to evict a woman from a building she owned, while she spent her last $8 keeping an old widow warm in it. He could have buried it. That was the thing he kept coming back to afterward. He could have closed the laptop, shredded the page, served the notices, and let it all go through the way 100 buildings had gone through before. No one would ever have known. The lawyers had missed it for years. He could have kept being the man he had been when he climbed those stairs. Instead, at 6 a.m, Garrett Voss got in his SUV and drove 300 miles to put a single piece of paper in front of Theodore Calloway. Theo did not see people without an appointment. He saw Garrett anyway, because Garrett walked past the assistant and laid the yellowed codicil on the glass desk and said 8 words. "Your father gave 1/3 of it away." Theo Calloway read the page. He was a hard man, a man who had not been moved by much in 30 years, and his face did not change for a long moment. Then he saw the name, Cordelia Fry, and something old and buried came up into his eyes, because Theo had been 12 years old when it was signed, and he remembered it now like a smell carried up out of childhood, a quiet woman who used to sit with his dying grandfather and hum a low song and bring the boy Theo a peppermint from her apron when no one was looking. He had not thought of her in 50 years. He had not known her name was on his building. He had not known his own father had loved her enough to deed her a piece of the only thing he had ever built. "Where is she?" Theo said. His voice had gone quiet in a way his assistants would not have recognized. "She passed," Garrett said. 18 months ago. A county bed." He paused, steadying his voice. "Her daughter's in apartment 4. We've been trying to evict her. She owns a third of this place and doesn't know it." He breathed out. "She's been spending her last dollars to keep an old widow upstairs warm while we tried to put her on the street." Theo Calloway sat back down. He was a man who had built an empire on never being surprised, on knowing the number before anyone else in the room. And he had just been handed a number he had carried his whole life, without ever once doing the arithmetic. A woman had sat with his grandfather in the dark. His father had loved her enough to write her into the only thing he ever built. And 40 years later, a company with Theo's own name 3 layers up the chain had sent a man to throw her daughter into the street over $4,000, while that daughter spent her last 8 on a widow's heat. Theo had made far more than $4,000 in the time it took Garrett to lay the page on his desk. Theo Calloway was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up, and the whole tone of the room changed, the slow turn a room makes when a powerful man finally decides to use his power for something other than himself. "Get my car," he said. "And stop everything at that building. Everything. Tonight, what happened next did not happen the way it happens in the movies. There was no courtroom, no shouting, no villain dragged out in handcuffs. The comeuppance, when it came, was quiet, the way the realest things are." Meridian Holdings received a call from the top of the company they did not know they belonged to, and by noon the next day, the regional manager who had ordered the Ardsley cleared was packing a box in a gray office, having learned that you do not, even by accident, try to throw a widow and a part owner into the street and expect to keep your desk. He was not screamed at. He was simply, permanently, no longer needed. He drove out of the lot in his own SUV and no one watched him go. And on Pickett Street, on a cold Tuesday evening with the light going blue over the rooftops, 2 cars pulled up in front of the Ardsley that had never pulled up on that street before. Garrett Voss got out of the first. An old man in a fine dark coat got out of the second and stood looking up at his father's building for a long moment, like a man returning to a place he should have come to 40 years sooner. Naomi was on the landing when they knocked. She had a basket of folded laundry on her hip and a notice in her pocket that said she had 9 days left, and she opened the door expecting more bad news. Because bad news was the only kind that ever climbed those stairs. Garrett took off the gray coat of his old life somewhere on that staircase, though no one saw him do it. He simply said, gently, "Miss Fry, this is Mr. Calloway. There's something you need to know about your mother." They sat in Naomi's small kitchen. The rich man and the laundress and the man who had come to evict her, and Theo Calloway laid the old codicil on the same scarred table where Cordy Fry had once counted out torn dollar bills, and he told a 34-year-old woman that her mother had owned a third of the world she died poor in, that the building was a third hers, that no one was putting her out, not in 9 days, not ever, that the back rent was forgiven, every dollar of it, because you cannot owe rent on a house you own. Naomi did not say anything for a long while. She ran her thumb over her mother's name in the old typed deed. Cordelia Fry, the same hand that had slid $5 bills under a widow's door for 40 years and never once let herself be thanked. "She never told me," Naomi said finally. 40 years, and she never told me she owned a brick of it. She never told anyone, Theo said. That was the kind of woman she was. My father knew it. That's why he gave it to her. He paused, and the hardness was gone from his voice entirely now. She gave before she had any way of knowing it would come back. So did you. I've watched the footage from that stairwell a dozen times. He looked at her. $8. Naomi looked at the man who had tried to evict her, sitting at her own table now with his hat in his hands, and at the rich man whose father her mother had nursed, and she did not feel triumphant. The clean, uncomplicated victory a person in a story is supposed to feel. She felt mostly tired, and underneath the tired, something quieter and harder to name, which was the feeling of being seen by the world after a lifetime of being walked past. She did not gloat. She had not been raised to. She only asked the one thing that mattered to her, which was not about the building or the deed or the money at all. Does Miss Ruth Ann have to know any of this happened? She said. She doesn't do well with change. Downstairs, Miss Ruth Ann Boyd never knew how close she had come to losing the only home she had left. The heat stayed on. The quarters stopped mattering. Theo Calloway quietly paid the backlight bill that had been creeping toward a shutoff and put the building under a trust that could never be sold out from under the people in it. And he set up a small fund in Cordelia Fry's name. That did one thing and one thing only. Every Friday, it kept the widow an apartment too warm, so that no one would ever again have to choose between the heat and the bread to do what was right. And Naomi kept sliding $8 under the door anyway. Because a fund is a kind thing, but it is not a hand. And some Fridays, when the old woman's memory was clear, Ruth Ann would call through the door, "Is that you, Cordy?" And now Naomi, who owned the very floor she knelt on, would press her hand to the wood and say soft, "It's me, Miss Ruth Ann. It's still me." And that was enough. Garrett Voss did not go back to emptying buildings. He could not, after that. Theo kept him on, of all things, to do the opposite of his old job, to find the Ardsleys and other dying towns and the people quietly holding them together, and to make sure the spreadsheets never again rolled over someone who had given more than they had. He called his daughter from the parking lot that first night, the one who never picked up, and this time, she did. He did not tell anyone what they said. He only came back up the stairs looking like a man who had set something heavy down. So here is what I want to ask you tonight, before the light goes all the way blue. Somewhere near you there is a Ruth Ann, a widow in a second-floor apartment who has not had a real conversation in a week, who would be glad, truly glad, about something the size of $8 and a hand pressed to a door. This story is fictional, but the loneliness it describes is not. Millions of older Americans go a full week or more without a single person knocking. The fund in this story is made up. The need it describes is sitting on your street right now, waiting on a knock. So if you have ever been the one who crossed the road when everyone else kept walking, write the word knocked in the comments, because we read every single one. And tell me which part stayed with you most. The taped dollars under the door, the name in the old deed, or the moment the old woman said, "Is that you, Cordy?" Subscribe so the next story finds you, and share this one with somebody who needs to make a knock they have been putting off. On the porch railing of the Ardsley now, in the evening light, somebody has set out 4 small things. 4 torn dollar bills, taped at the seams, folded once, creased small and careful. Money a poor woman means to give away and never get back. They do not need to be there. The heat is paid for. The building is safe. Cordelia Fry has been gone almost 2 years. and her daughter owns a third of the bricks her mother died serving. The bills sit there anyway, in the blue light, because that is what the $8 always meant. Not the money, the remembering. Naomi Frey learned it from her mother, and her mother learned it from a rich man's deathbed. And a rich man's son learned it at 63, on a staircase he never meant to climb. Garrett Voss learned it last of all, and slowest. And that is its own kind of grace, because it is never too late to become the person who knocks. The kindness that changes the world is the kind you give before you know it will ever come back to you. That's the quiet coin. I'll see you in the next story.